Much like Mozart before him, a musical child prodigy would rise to stardom in the first half of the 19th century, entertaining royalty and astonishing audiences throughout Europe. Unlike Mozart, ladies threw their knickers at him. His concerts would end with mobs of crazed fans storming the stage, desperately attempting to touch him or grab one of his gloves as a souvenir. Women fainted at the sight of him, and men were left speechless by his performances. He was passionately loved and bitterly reviled, variously described as a saint and a sinner, a tortured artist, an adulterous seducer, a genius, a demon, and the greatest pianist of all time. In the words of biographer Dr. Oliver Hilmes, today's superstars would look like little schoolboys compared to Franz Liszt. Join me for a musical journey into the DATACOMBS as we explore the rise of the world's first rock star and the hysteria that followed. Adam and Anna Liszt welcomed their first and only child into the world on the 22nd of October, 1811, in the small market town of Dorbjörn in the Kingdom of Hungary. Adam was a gifted musician who played the piano, violin, organ, and guitar, in addition to singing in church choirs. As a young man, he had the privilege of working with Beethoven and played cello in the orchestra of the House of Esterházy under the direction of Joseph Haydn. At the time of his son's birth, Adam was employed by Prince Nicholas II of Esterházy, both as a musician and as a clerk who had the illustrious job of overseeing the prince's herd of 50,000 sheep. Franz Liszt was a sickly but gifted boy who would soon become widely regarded as a child prodigy. He first showed interest in music at the age of 5, captivated by his father's piano playing as well as the music he heard in church and from the many gypsy bands, a contemporary's words, not mine, that traveled throughout Hungary. Franz began playing music when he was 7 and composed his first piece at the age of 8. His father, seeing his son as the next Mozart, implemented a rigorous regime of practicing piano playing, musical transposition, and technical exercises. In the fall of 1820, 9-year-old Franz performed his first public concert to a group of wealthy Hungarian noblemen. They were so taken with his talent that they offered to finance his musical education in Vienna. Adam took a year of absence from his sheep-keeping duties to accompany his son to the capital of the musical world, where he studied with Beethoven's pupil Carl Czerny and the musical director of the Viennese court, Antonio Salieri, although he is perhaps more commonly known as that guy from Amadeus. By the time Franz Liszt made his official debut as a pianist in Vienna in December 1822, he was already a celebrity. The 11-year-old musician was welcomed into court circles, where he performed private concerts in the homes of the nobility. He was introduced to Schubert, as well as Beethoven, later recalling that the old composer bestowed a kiss upon his forehead. One critic described him as a little Hercules fallen from the clouds. In 1823, the Liszt family set out on an extensive concert tour, following the same routes taken by young Mozart some 60 years earlier. They began with an incredibly successful series of concerts throughout Germany, before crossing the Channel to England, where Franz played for King George IV at Windsor Castle, then continued on to France and Switzerland. The endless series of tours and traveling took a toll on the young musician. By 1827, Franz was seriously considering giving up his career and entering the priesthood. Determined to put a stop to this nonsense, Adam took Franz to Boulogne, where he hoped sea baths would improve his son's health. Instead, the overbearing stage parent caught typhoid and died. His father's sudden death struck a devastating blow to the 16-year-old Franz. He gave up touring and moved to Paris, where he taught music to support himself and his mother, working odd hours while simultaneously taking up a lifelong habit of heavy drinking and cigar smoking. Misfortune found Franz again in 1828 when he fell in love with one of his students, the beautiful daughter of King Charles X's Minister of Commerce. Her father refused to give permission for the two to marry, sending Franz into a terrible depression. He became so ill that Parisian newspapers printed his obituary. He did not play the piano for over a year, and again considered joining the priesthood. In 1830, King Charles X was overthrown during the July Revolution. The fervent spirit of freedom throughout Paris inspired Liszt to take up the piano once again, composing a revolutionary symphony to celebrate the event. His return to public life would take a dramatic turn in the spring of 1832, when he attended a charity concert performed by the renowned virtuoso violinist Niccolò Paganini. Liszt was astonished not only by his technical ability, but also with the powerful, unbridled emotion with which he played, and the dramatic showmanship of his performance, remarking, "What a man, what a violin, what an artist! Heavens, what suffering, what misery, what tortures in those 4 strings." Liszt set out to do for the piano what Paganini had done for the violin, to push the instrument to its absolute limit and become the leading virtuoso of his time. He practiced with the passion of a religious zealot, mastering the newly developed 3-hand technique of complicated, interlocking hand positions that made it appear as if he was playing with 3 or even 4 hands. During this time, he formed a close friendship with fellow composer Frédéric Chopin, whose influence helped to develop Liszt's poetic and romantic side. He also began the first of his many affairs with married women after meeting the Countess Marie d'Arglon. In 1835, she abandoned her family and the pair moved to Geneva, where Liszt taught music and wrote many solo piano pieces, while Marie bore him 3 children. Their adulterous familial bliss would come to an end in 1839, when Liszt heard that plans to erect a large monument to Beethoven in Vienna were at the brink of financial collapse. To prevent this insult to the great man's memory, Liszt immediately pledged his support, leaving behind a quiet life with his mistress and children to embark on a series of money-raising tours. So began what modern musicologists call the Glanz period, or the golden age of transcendental execution. During the next 8 years, he performed over 1,000 recitals and made more than 3,000 public appearances, virtually inventing the profession of the international concert pianist in the process. He traveled by carriage from London to Istanbul, from Portugal to St. Petersburg, astonishing audiences far and wide with his intensely passionate and unbelievably complicated playing technique. Before his time, a concert by a solo pianist was not considered to be entertaining enough to hold the attention of a large crowd. Liszt sought to subvert these expectations by inventing what he called recital as a performance. Not simply a musical experience, but one of highly expressive physical theatrics, a dramatic departure from the austere, sober performances of his contemporaries. Liszt began each performance by flaunting tradition. Rather than being seated at the piano as the curtain was raised, he strode forth from the wings of the theater, strutting across the stage to take his seat at the piano. No sheet music was present, despite the fact that playing from memory was considered to be an unacceptable sign of arrogance. Liszt didn't fucking give a damn. He played with the piano top open and placed the instrument in side profile so the audience could see the intense expressions of his face and wild playing of his hands. His fingers seemed to stretch and grow longer, wrote one observer, as though they were attached to springs, and at times even seemed to detach themselves from his hands altogether. As he played, he whipped his shoulder-length hair around in a form of classical headbanging, shooting beads of sweat into the crowd. In a review for the prestigious New Journal of Music, Robert Schumann wrote, "The demon began to flex his muscles, first played along with the audience, as if to feel them out, and then give them a taste of something more substantial, until, with his magic, he had ensnared each and every one, and could move them this way or that as he chose. It is unlikely that any other artist has the power to lift, carry, and deposit an audience to such a high degree. We are overwhelmed by an onslaught of sounds and sensations. In a matter of seconds, we have been exposed to tenderness, daring, fragrance, and madness. The instrument glows and sparkles under the hands of its master. It has to be heard and seen to be believed." Another described witnessing Liszt's countenance assumed the agony of expression, mingled with radiant smiles of joy, which I never saw in any other human face, except in the paintings of our Savior, and that one could physically feel the intensity of the performance as the floor shook like a wire. He played with such ferocity that he often broke piano strings, sometimes destroying the instrument beyond repair. The popularity of his violent playing style forced piano manufacturers to implement more heavy-duty construction methods to withstand the sheer physical force of Liszt's playing. The great Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen described a performance in Hamburg in 1840. "He seemed to me a demon nailed fast to the instrument, whence the tones streamed forth. They came from his blood, from his thoughts. He was on the rack, his blood flowed and nerves trembled. I saw that pale face assume a brighter expression. The divine soul shone from his eyes and from every feature. He became as beauteous as only spirit and enthusiasm can make their worshippers. During one particularly dramatic performance, Liszt played with such force that he suddenly fainted at the piano. A gentleman named Henry Reeve described the dreadful scene that followed as the limp body of the composer was carried off the stage. The whole room sat breathless with fear until German composer Ferdinand Hiller announced that Liszt was already restored to consciousness and was comparatively well again. Reeves recalled that as he left the theater, both he and his female companion trembled like poplar leaves, and I tremble scarcely less as I write this. Ladies in particular were struck by the handsome, tortured romantic, admiring his strong jawline, chiseled features, and attractively disheveled hair. His eyes were soft yet penetrating. His large hands were incredibly strong and nimble. Standing at over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man was only 5'5", he towered over his audiences. Furthermore, he was a sharp dresser. His black three-piece suits were impeccably tailored, and his silk cravats were perfectly tied around the fashionably high collars of his crisp white shirt. While some were less than impressed with his looks, one Russian critic wrote, "I did not find his face handsome at all." Liszt's popularity with the ladies was about to skyrocket, completely out of control. The composer arrived in Berlin at the end of 1841, playing his first recital there on December 27th. Although it was not unusual for his concerts to elicit voracious applause, the reaction from this audience was different. As Liszt appeared on the stage, hundreds of female concertgoers began loudly cheering and screaming, while others fainted dead away. Even in the front row, ladies used their opera glasses to get a closer look at the famous musician. This performance marked the beginning of a phenomenon described by biographer Dr. Oliver Holmes as a highly infectious strain of LISZTOMANIA that gripped Europe for years at a time. To put it more bluntly, things were about to get absolutely batshit crazy. The fanatical frenzy surrounding Liszt only escalated from here. It soon became popular to wear his portrait on expensive brooches and cameo jewelry. Instead of throwing flowers on stage following a performance, women threw their clothing and jewels. He was physically attacked by massive mobs of obsessive fans who rushed the stage, tearing off bits of his clothing and grasping for locks of his hair to keep his mementos. More composed ladies were content to leave his concerts with broken piano strings, wearing them in lockets and mounting them in frames to be worshipped as relics. Liszt seemed to revel in the attention. He would purposefully leave his gloves on the piano, and then look on as ravenous fans stormed the stage and fought over possession of the prize. Aristocratic ladies tore out each other's hair as they attempted to obtain handkerchiefs he threw into the audience, ripping the trophy to shreds in the process. When the musician appeared off stage, women literally threw themselves at his feet. Some fainted upon the sight of the young, dashing pianist, while others were unable to contain their excitement and went uncontrollably mad. They collected the dregs of his coffee grounds from the bottom of empty glasses and carried them in glass vials. The stumps of cigars he had smoked were particularly prized. An eyewitness recalled that, on one occasion, a woman snatched up a half-smoked cigar that Liszt had cast aside, and in spite of repeatedly retching, she continued to smoke it with feigned delight. Another tells of an infatuated lady-in-waiting who plucked one of his cigar butts from the gutter and had it encased in a diamond monogrammed locket which she wore constantly at court, despite the foul odor it emitted. Swooning ladies were not the only ones to show wild displays of admiration for the pianist. In 1842, King Frederick William of Prussia provided Liszt with a royal coach pulled by 6 horses, followed by a procession of 30 additional carriages and an honor guard. One music critic wrote of the spectacle as Liszt departed Berlin, not like a king, but as a king. The government of Prussia issued Liszt official passport documents that simply bore the words "Celebrité sous sa notice," or "sufficiently known by his fame." In true rockstar fashion, Liszt once listed himself in a hotel register as a musician-philosopher whose travel destination was in transit from doubt to truth. Despite the widespread fanfare, Franz Liszt did have his detractors. Many of his contemporaries and colleagues disliked his regal offstage persona. Felix Mendelssohn was appalled by Liszt's theatrics and the hysterical hero worship that surrounded him. His reputation as a ladies' man with a particular fondness for seducing married noblewomen made him infamous. His spurned lover, the Countess of Anjou, denounced him as a Don Juan parvenu, while others called him Mephistopheles disguised as an abbé. Polite society was shocked by the audacity of his behavior, casually strolling off the stage and into the front row, conversing with nobility as if they were his equals. On one occasion, Tsar Nicholas I arrived late to a recital in 1840 and began talking during the performance. Liszt abruptly stopped playing and sat motionless with his head bowed. When Nicholas inquired as to why the music did not continue, Liszt sarcastically replied, "Music herself should be silent when Nicholas speaks." While performing in Kiev in 1847, Liszt met the unhappily married Princess Caroline von Wittgenstein. That September, he gave his last paid concert, before retreating to the princess's vast, secluded estates in the Ukraine. The composer abandoned his life of touring as the most famous virtuoso in the world, breaking the hearts of thousands of devoted fans. As suddenly as it had erupted, the phenomena of LISZTOMANIA had come to an end. The couple soon moved to Rome and attempted to persuade the Pope to annul the princess's marriage, but to the dubious delight of many women, their efforts were unsuccessful. Liszt returned to Germany, where he spent much of the 1850s as a close friend and financial supporter of Richard Wagner. Wagner, a married man, soon began an affair with Liszt's daughter Cosima, the only surviving child of his affair with the Countess d'Aguillou. Despite Liszt's disapproval of the scandalous relationship, the two composers remained steadfast friends. After the deaths of their respective partners, Cosima and Wagner married in 1870. Liszt spent his final years moving between Rome, Weimar, and Budapest, teaching large groups of musicians in what he called master classes, the first use of that term. He lived by his personal motto, Je n'ai obligé, believing that he was obliged by the gift of his genius to help others. He gave away all of his performance fees to charity, donating to hospitals, churches, schools, and humanitarian organizations while creating pension funds for musicians. When the Great Fire of Hamburg left thousands homeless, he held a series of concerts for their benefit. In 1881, a fall from a staircase left Liszt bedridden for several weeks, during which time he descended into despair as his health began to decline. Although he had suffered from periodic episodes of melancholy throughout his life, the death of Wagner in 1883 sent him into a deeper desperation than ever before. The dark tone of the music he wrote in this period speaks to his frame of mind. The composer remarked, "I carry a deep sadness of the heart, which must now and then break out in sound." In 1886, while attending the Bayreuth Festival in Germany, Liszt complained of ill health. He developed a fever, but insisted on attending 2 performances of Wagner's music in his friend's honor. The fever soon developed into pneumonia, and on July 31st, at the age of 74, Franz Liszt died. Immediately, there were disputes between his birthplace of Hungary and the city of Weimar, Germany, over where his illustrious remains would be entombed. However, Cosima insisted that her father should forever remain in Bayreuth, close to the grave of Richard Wagner. Against the late composer's wishes, Franz Liszt was buried there, in a Lutheran cemetery on August 3, 1886. The term LISZTOMANIA first appeared in Heinrich Heine's review of the Parisian musical season of 1844. He was initially skeptical, writing, "When I heard of the fainting spells which broke out in Germany, and especially in Berlin, when Liszt showed himself there, I shrugged my shoulders pityingly, believing this behavior to be no more than a matter of spectacle for the spectacle's sake." However, the critic soon changed his tune, writing, "Yet I was mistaken. Last week, at the Italian Opera House, where Liszt gave his concert, how convulsively his mere appearance affected them. How boisterous was the applause which rang to meet him. What acclaim it was! A veritable insanity, one unheard of in the annals of furor." Physicians consider this passionate obsession with Liszt to be a very real form of mental disorder, comparing the hysterical behavior and elevated levels of arousal experienced in the presence of the composer to the manic states of euphoria witnessed in madhouses. Heinz attempted to discern the reason of this phenomena by consulting a physician whose specialty is female diseases, and whom I asked to explain the magic our Liszt exerted upon the public. The physician listed a plethora of possibilities, including magnetism, galvanism, electricity, the contagion of the close hall filled with countless wax lights, and several hundred perfumed and perspiring human beings, historical epilepsy, the phenomena of tickling, musical cantharides, and other scabraceous things. Hein concluded, "Perhaps the solution of the question is not buried in such adventurous depths. It seems to me at times that all this sorcery may be explained by the fact that no one on earth knows so well how to organize the success, or rather their mise en scene, as our Franz Liszt." Biographer Alan Walker disagrees that the composer orchestrated this reaction himself. "He was very handsome, very virile. The ladies fell over him themselves to get close to him, and he was always very fond of female company. But to blame Liszt for this, as many of his contemporaries did, is rather like blaming Niagara Falls for the suicides." Whatever the true cause of LISZTOMANIA may have been, one cannot dispute that it was a very real phenomena, one that cemented the figure of a larger-than-life musician with legions of love-struck fans into the public consciousness. In fact, the word celebrity, as we know it, first came to use during Liszt's rise to fame in the 1830s. For better or for worse, whether he intended to or not, Liszt paved the way for the fandom culture and pop idol worship that is so prevalent today. In the prophetic words of the Princess Caroline, Liszt has flung his spear far into the future.